Okay, everyone. Today I am here with Nigel Palmer, who has so much amazing information, and he's going to share a little bit about that with us today. And I got his book, The Regenerative Grower's Guide to Garden Amendments, and I just thought that was wonderful because it's all about using locally sourced materials to make mineral and biological extracts and ferments for your garden so that you don't have to go and spend a mint at the garden center. You don't have to go and track down obscure things from somewhere else. That's one of the things that frustrates me with a lot of herbalism programs and some gardening programs that they say, well, you have to use this exotically sourced ingredient. Well, nature doesn't work like that. Nature just uses what's here, what's available. And of course, it's also very budget friendly if you can use what you can get locally. So I thought it was just a wonderfully done book, and it's broken down into two sections. The first section explains the background with the soil web and how to use the tools like the refractometer to test things. And then the second section gets into how to make the different amendments. So, Nigel, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day and tell me a little bit about your background.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to share this information. Um, my background is I've been a gardener since I was in my 20s. Growing food has always been something fun to do. And it's also something that's important to introduce children to. So that stage of our life is come and gone. And then when we were in our 40s, we recognized that growing our own food was the best healthcare program here in the United States. And in order to eliminate GMO, pesticides, herbicides, and other toxins that are in the food supply, the only way we really could approach that was to grow our own. So we endeavored to grow a year's worth of blueberries, a year's worth of potatoes, a year's worth of garlic, and so on and so on. And as this grew, we ended up growing quite a bit of food. This was also translated into our household. My wife, Joan, has a school that she started, the Institute of Sustainable Nutrition. And in that program, she teaches not only nutrition, but also homemade remedies and kitchen medicine and the things that people used to do to deal with the health problems and things like that. And so what we recognized when we were in our 50s was that this was essentially our life. This is how we live. And we recognized how important it is to share this information with others. And so I taught the garden portion of her school. And in the process of doing that, recognized how hard it is to gather all of this information into one place. As you suggested, there are many different sorts of information out there, but none of it really is in one place that you can use as a toolbox of ideas in order to move this forward yourself. And so after spending an awful lot of time trying to gather recipes and understand what's really going on in the soil, I realized that it was really important to share this information with others. And that's what prompted me to write a recipe book or a toolbox of ideas that anybody can approach in order to do the same things that we were doing. I was an aerospace engineer for 36 years, and my job was essentially solving complex technical issues, system level issues. And the soil is nothing more than a complex technical system. And the understanding of the nuances of that fit right into my background and has facilitated my abilities to take very difficult ideas and boil them down into simple sentences that most people can understand.
Yeah, and that was one thing that I really appreciated about your text, that it was, as I mentioned when we before we started recording, that it's very easy to understand for, I think the average person could just come in with not the tactical background and then be able to do things to help their garden improve their yields. But it's also not talking down to people, and I appreciate that too, because I think you strike a great balance with that. It's technical enough, but not too technical.
Thanks.
Yeah, so that people with some background aren't going to feel like, oh, this is just all beginner stuff. So, because you have a lot of different information in there. And yeah, I had actually gone through making a couple of the amendments last week with the folks in our list, and I got a lot of positive feedback. We did a simple vinegar extract and then the fermented plant juice. So,
Those are great places to start. They're very inexpensive, often for free. You can make your own vinegar very easily, for
mhm,
instance. And what's really cool is they really work. One of the things that I did when I first started making fermented plant juices and vinegar extractions is I wanted to understand what minerals were actually in the different amendments that I was making. And so I searched around for different labs in order to do that analysis. And I eventually found a lab that would do the analysis relatively inexpensively. And it would measure all 18 minerals of those minerals that were led to believe that plants need. By the way, I think they need more than 18. I think they need them all. We
mhm.
just haven't out yet. And so I did analysis on a fermented plant juice. I'm going to take tomatoes, just talking. There it is. There's the analysis in the
Yep,
book.
yep.
By the way, I also have that analysis on my website, and it's a far more extensive listing. And I also invite others to do the analysis because I realize after speaking with people all over the world, some people in parts of the world might not have stinging nettle growing, but they may have something else. Anyway, when I did the analysis, I was really surprised, but then it became intuitively obvious that just about every plant out there contained all 18 of those minerals. It had cobalt, it had molybdenum, it had selenium, it had nickel, it had manganese, boron, and then of course the calciums and the sulfur and the silicons and all of these minerals. They were all there, but they were in proportions that that plant had mined from the soil. And I thought to myself, well, now I know where I'm going to go and find cobalt. Now I know where I'm going to find molybdenum. I don't have to purchase cobalt that's mined in South Africa and traveled over however many distances and leagues and packages and who knows the conditions of the people that are actually doing the mining and all of those things. And so I can get it by just fermenting a plant around my backyard for very cheap, and it becomes sustainable. This moves to the whole idea of sustainability because I can get it here at home for very inexpensively and cheap and not have to rely on oil or business or packaging or transportation costs. And so this was really exciting for me. The other thing that it caused me to realize was that that apple that I'm eating has all of the minerals in it in proportions that apples have. And so not only did I realize that I had found a source for trace minerals for feeding my plants, but I also recognized how important it is for me to eat these plants because this is where I'm going to get the minerals. And of course, the plants get the minerals from the soil. And so this begins to tie that whole conversation of why is the soil important? Why is soil health so important? Well, it's the minerals in the soil that we're going to eat and help our own health. It's the minerals that are going to make healthy plants, that are going to make healthy people. And then we get into the idea of, well, how do those minerals in the soil get broken down and actually enter into the plants? And now we talk about the biology in the soil and how important the biological components of soil are. And so it quickly weaves this idea of agriculture and the health of the people and the food that they're eating. Of course, in years past, civilizations were defined by the soil their food was grown on. Food wasn't transported all over the world. So when you lived in some small community and the food was grown just outside of town in the fields and things like that, that defined the health of the community. And in fact, there are many, many instances of recognizing health problems in communities around the world. And essentially, it's tied to either the lack of or the excesses of specific minerals in those soils and the fact that the people either are or are not getting them. And so it quickly ties into this whole idea of being part of the earth, recognizing that we're eating essentially the minerals that are available in the soil that the plants and the biology are making available to us.
Mhm. And conversely, too, that the blue zone areas around the earth are linked to population centers where they have their indigenous diet and it is balanced and they eat from the soil, and then they're actually seeing these blue zones pretty much shrink and disappear as the modern food system is coming in and effectively poisoning the people. And it
Yes.
was very sad and frustrating to me. I was watching the Blue Zone documentary series that's on TV, and here was the elder. He was in his upper 90s, I think, and then had his daughter, and then the daughter had the grandchild, and the grandchild was being fed packaged crackers or something, and the daughter saying, "Well, the kids just won't eat that." Well, they would eat that if you ate that and you fed that to them, because that's how things work. Because I know with my kids, they were so proud when they were growing their first vegetables out of the garden, and they just couldn't, they had grandma and grandpa over, and it's like, "Yeah, we grew these beans, we grew these," and then it's culture, and we've lost a lot of that food culture, and that's unfortunate. So,
Yeah.
um, speaking of nutrient availability in the soil, can you talk to how glyphosate impacts that negatively? Because I know, I've read a lot about that, and I think people just aren't familiar with it. Everything's glyphosate, you know, um, almost all the corn and soy and cotton and canola oil. Canola oil, that's a funny one, but rapeseed oil, everything's sprayed with glyphosate. And we're told that it's safe and it breaks down in the soil. But I think the soil food web would beg to differ. Can you maybe share your input on that and your perspective on that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic back in the day, what, 50 years ago or something like that. And the other deleterious effect of glyphosate is its ability to chelate minerals and make them unavailable to plants in the soil. And so when you're growing your Roundup Ready corn, you're spraying your field with glyphosate to begin with, which essentially kills the biology in the soil and makes minerals unavailable to that corn plant as it grows. And so, right off the bat, by definition, a rational mind who's familiar with the fact that we are eating minerals in the soil that plants and biology make available to us so that we can be healthy would recognize that you're automatically putting yourself behind the eight ball with that situation. You're killing the soil biology and you're making minerals unavailable. Well, that Roundup Ready corn will grow in that environment. Nothing else, very few things else will grow there. And the nutrition in those products will reflect that. Never mind the deleterious effects of Roundup itself, which will get into your system. One of the arguments that the companies that make Roundup make is that the Roundup itself will not affect the biological function of human beings. By the way, Roundup has a half-life of about 22 years. And so it's not going away fast. And there are some ways you can remediate it. We could talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd
But
be great.
the point is that the Roundup will not affect a lot of the human functionality, but it does affect the shikimate pathway, which is something that the gut biology uses. And so this is a link between the use of Roundup and the significant hockey stick rise in many digestive disorders like leaky gut, irritable bowel, and on it goes. And people like Stephanie Seneff of MIT University has documented these relationships, and she was turned on to these conversations essentially by the work of Don Huber, who is a professor emeritus at Purdue University. So there's a lot of work out there that shows these deleterious effects. But I think most importantly is once we understand this basic relationship between the soil biology, the minerals in the soil and the uptake of minerals by plants that provide us with these minerals, it becomes intuitively obvious how deleterious these sorts of things are. And so this is one of the things that I'm trying to bring out in not only my book, but in conversations, is once you start going down this path, it becomes intuitively obvious that these are crazy ideas. And then you got to wonder, well, how did we get here, and how much money is really being dumped into Washington? And we could talk about Citizens United and the funding of Congress. But anyway, we shouldn't go there.
maybe next time. But yeah, have you read Toxic Legacy, that book?
No, I haven't.
That gets into the glyphosate issues and the pathways and things like that. It's a really well done, and references Don Huber's work and a lot of different things with the larger picture of glyphosate that is not generally presented to the public. And when I read that, I was just like, I knew it. So, but that one is not necessarily as easy to follow for the layperson, but it was still a very interesting read. So
yeah, I've been hanging around with Don Huber for maybe 10 or 15 years now. I met him at Acres probably about 15 years ago. And we've had him come and speak with Stephanie Seneff at Jones School probably about 5 or maybe more years ago. So I basically have stopped reading about glyphosate because I think its deleterious effects are just way too obvious. And in fact, the world organizations are beginning to recognize that as well. There's some lawsuits that are pretty prominent that are making this clear as well. The problem is that the American public as an entity has not woken up to these conversations and ideas. And again, this is why these sorts of conversations are so important.
Well, I think that's, of course, by design to some extent, because there's a lot of money changing hands. And what do you say to the people who say, but we can't feed the world without glyphosate? Because that's the argument that I see presented again and again and again.
Yeah, well, that's just malarkey. When you think about the earth and the ecosystem and agriculture as a relationship between soil health, plant health, the biology in the soil, the diversity of the biology in the soil, it's just fundamental to recognize that we're in a spiral of a death spiral, if you will, by carrying on these ideas of killing the soil, killing the biology, and it just fundamentally won't work. The more you use Roundup, the more you use these chemicals, the more you kill the soil biology, the more neutered the soil becomes, the more toxic the soil becomes. And to think that that's the only way to feed the world is just misguided. And it doesn't take an awful lot of time or effort to recognize that it's soil health that is going to feed the world. And those people that are doing it, and more people are doing it, have not only testimony, but also make it clear that that's the only way out is to feed the soil, to promote soil biology, and most importantly, to increase the stable carbon content, the humic structure within the soil, which is the foundation for biological activity and housing, as well as water retention. And quite frankly, if we could go a step further, this is how we're going to affect climate change. Climate change is fundamentally about agriculture. It is the agriculture, it is the plants in the world that monitor temperature, that regulate temperature by the evaporation and condensation of moisture. And as we destroy more and more plant habitat on Earth, we are literally reducing the planet's ability to regulate temperature and water and all of the things that are naturally going on. So it doesn't take an awful lot of time, effort to come to understand these cycles and understand the trueness of the conversation. And again, people that think that chemicals are the only way to feed the world are marketers. And unfortunately, marketing in the United States is an extremely powerful method of communication. And far too few of us have the time to sit down and think about agriculture the way we might when we've got kids running around or somebody sick in the house or elderly people that need help or not enough money to get a decent job and funding associated with work and all of the other problems that have been laid upon us. It makes it very difficult to think about a worldview, to think about local politics, to think about what's really going on in your own backyard.
Hmm. And you've been doing this for a very long time, but I know that as I have improved the soil structure, that my pest and disease issues have been virtually eliminated. And so can you explain, what you've seen in your gardens in that respect, how using these full spectrum amendments make that difference and make plants basically inedible to pests and disease, not affected by disease. What you've
Yeah.
seen and how.
Well, one of the things that was striking to me was the work of a gentleman by the name of Tom Dykstra. And what he has done, he's worked an awful lot with insects over the years. He was interested in the work of Phil Callahan back in the day and has
Hmm.
carried on some of his work. But Tom Dykstra has made it clear that you can determine the health of a plant or the sugar content of the plant sap by the insects that are actually eating it, which was really cool. And so if you have aphid problems or these sucking type insects that are bothering your plants in your garden, then you basically have a garden full of plants that have a sap of about 7% sucrose or 7 brix on your scale. And what's going on there is that that's a very unhealthy plant. And it's actually emitting infrared radiation that says to insects all around, come and eat here. This is the place to go. And quite frankly, we're very lucky to have this system. Otherwise, we'd be filled with an awful lot of garbage because the insects wouldn't be digesting this stuff and breaking it down into organic matter that could be used in the soil. As the health of a plant increases and you get closer to a brix or a percent sucrose content of about 10, 11, and 12, the aphid type insects aren't going to bother your plants anymore, but you're going to see more of the beetle type problems, the potato beetles and things like that. And as your plants get healthier still, you will eliminate insect pressure pretty well altogether. And this is another comment that's really important is you're not eliminating the insect, you're pretty well defining where it's going to eat. When we talk about pathogens, whether it's powdery mildew or some fungal activity or whatever it is, these bacteria and fungi, they exist all the time everywhere. The difference between a problem in the garden and not is they get out of balance. And so when we think about pathogens and problems in the garden, these are balance problems, whether it's a mineral balance or a population of the bacteria balance. And we could start talking about the work of Olivier Husson, who has shown the relationship between the voltage in the soil and the acidity in the soil, which is just absolutely fascinating stuff. And begins to give light to the idea of the electrical model in the soil, which is really something that I've been focusing on in the last few years. So the point is that once we start learning these things, we recognize that the pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, and glyphosate, and all these things that we're doing to the soil is just moving the plant towards unhealthiness and the requirement for the pesticides and herbicides. And if we started focusing on soil health, we'd be moving towards higher sucrose, higher sugar content in our plants, and moving towards insect-free problems. And this goes back to the idea of feeding the planet food. Well, the first thing is that we throw away 50%, or you pick a number, huge percentage of the food we grow anyway. And we don't have a food problem as far as quantity, we have a food distribution problem, which is another story altogether. And
I would
so,
actually interject too in there, we have a food quality problem because
indeed,
so many people, I'm a people watcher and I admit it, I see people who are even thin, but they'll have that inflammation belly. And people, I think, are overeating calories because that was the deal. Take calories out of the equation. Make sure food is affordable. So we're going to subsidize, the government's subsidizing poisoning the American public because they want to make food cheap and readily available. But they're selling them food that is not nourishing. So then people are eating more because they're not getting those minerals in the corn product or the whatever product because it's been chelated out of the soil that the product is grown in. So then they eat more and they're trying to fill that emptiness. Well, the emptiness in their soul, but the emptiness in their belly too, that they're missing those minerals, and the body, I think, has the sense for that. And so they're trying to eat, but they're not getting satisfied. And that was again back to the blue zone thing, that these people were eating very modest meals compared to what a typical spread is on a table, when you go in a restaurant here, but they were satisfied because the food was very nutrient dense.
Yeah. Right.
So, and I'm sure that ties into your wife's work too. And, that's wonderful that the two of you can, cover the bases together, that you are showing how to grow the food and then she's showing how to prepare it and, different ways to work with that too.
The other thing is the similarities between the human body and the soil. When we think
Mm-hmm.
of the soil digestive system for the plant, the human gut is another digestive system that basically functions on the use of bacteria and fungus and
Mm-hmm.
different organisms that are doing that. And I mean, it doesn't take long to figure out that we're only a small percent human, and a lot of the living entities in our body are bacteria and other things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there's a great correlation between what's going on in our bodies and what's going on in the soil.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, things getting out of balance, people dealing with yeast infections or bacterial overgrowth in their gut. Well, it's not that those bacteria aren't normally there or the yeast isn't normally there. It's just fallen out of balance because we're eating food that's out of balance. We're being exposed to different things in the environment that are shoving things out of balance. But
Right. So just
mhm.
like in the soil, the gut is what's going to prosper in the gut is dependent on the food that you provide it. If you provide leafy greens that are healthy, that have high bricks, then you're going to be growing different bacteria than if you eat ice cream, for instance. But
And your taste will adjust too and change. And the wonderful thing about the high bricks fruits and vegetables too is not only are they more insect and disease resistant, they also taste better. And I know
they
I taste things in the garden and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so good. And my it's a story I've told my readers before, but um my father-in-law is not a really big foodie, but he's got certain things he won't eat. And when he was here helping us building our deck when we first got started, I had cucumbers from the garden, and I came inside a little bit early because the guys were working outside, and I was throwing a quick supper together. And while I was prepping the rest of supper, I sliced up some cucumbers and just salted them and put them on a plate for the guys to munch on while they were cleaning up and finishing up the project. And he's like, "Oh, those are cucumbers. I don't eat those." And my husband says, "Oh, come on, Dad, just try them." And then he checked out one and he's like, "Oh, those are good." He says, "I don't eat cucumbers, but I'll eat those." So so it's a good way to win over vegetable people who say they hate vegetables, because homegrown vegetables, healthily grown vegetables, are not the same flavor-wise as commercial industrial
not
vegetables.
not only flavor, but also the compounds that are in them.
Hmm.
We eat, for instance, blueberries. A lot of people eat blueberries for the antioxidants that are in those blueberries. Well, if your plant has a low brix, then they don't have the energy and the resources to make those antioxidants. So just because you're buying organic blueberries in the store does not mean they have the antioxidants that you think you're going to be getting.
Hmm. And you can taste it too. It's something you're picking off your bushes fresh at home versus something that's been bred for durability and, yeah, long shipping and shelf stability, and they're just flat. They're not as yummy. I like the yummies. It's a good thing. So if you
Yeah.
were going to talk to a gardener who had never done any of this stuff before, what plan would you outline for them? Where would you tell them to start? And then just kind of break it down a little bit. Where would you point? What direction would you point them?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question because I get that question an awful lot from those
Hmm.
exact people. Take some of my programs and ask questions at talks that I give. And the first thing I tell them is you're already on the path. The fact that you're interested in these ideas and you have a garden and you're actually growing something means you're already well on your way. And so I like to give people credit for the things that they're already doing, the fact that they're aware of the conversation, the fact that they are putting their hands in the soil. And so I think that there's a great amount of benefit and worth in those things alone. The next thing I like to tell people is that there's no such thing as a silver bullet. Unfortunately, the marketing cartel of the United States has convinced
Hmm.
us that all you got to do is take one of these and
Just one
everything's going
cool
to be
trick. One
one
cool
cool trick.
trick. Yep.
And just not the way it is. And when we grow food, it's more of a rain barrel with staves on it, and it's the stave that's the lowest in the barrel that determines the amount of water in there. And that's the same with growing food as well. I've talked about biology, soil, and minerals as linchpins in your growing environment. And so the key is to try and improve all of those things. So what I would tell people is that become aware of the fact that you want as diverse a soil biology as possible. You want to build up the organic structure in your soil, and you need to have minerals available to the plant. And it's really that simple. And so whatever you do year after year, you need to constantly improve, regenerate. And that's what regenerative growing is all about, in my opinion. It's regenerating the soil. It's improving the soil, creating a new environment in the soil that's different than wherever you start. Most of our soils are in poor shape for a whole bunch of reasons. So once we understand that and we move forward to improving that year after year, then everything falls into place. Um, and what's really cool about it is the changes that are going to be seen are not the step changes necessarily that people are looking for. A lot of the changes are nuanced. For instance, you might see the number of frogs and snakes in your garden increase. You might see the color of the flowers. You might see the size of the fruit. You might see the number of fruit, whatever it is. These things are slow and they change year to year to year. Every year is a new canvas. And so every year, some things are going to do good and some things are going to do not so good. And this is why it's so important to talk to other people in your area. For instance, last year, there were no peaches on my trees at all. They didn't even flower. And I thought, well, geez, what the heck happened? But then you talk to people around the area and everybody had the same experience. And so it was really easy to tie it into those 3 days in February where the temperature got to minus 10 degrees that
Mm.
may have caused some damage to those flowers. Or it may have been the one day in the middle of May where temperatures got to 26 degrees Fahrenheit, well below freezing, that could have done them in. Or the rain and the lack of insects. But anyway, all of a sudden we're able to think of it otherwise rather than what did I do specifically
Hmm.
to that plant area. And so those are the kinds of things that you might want to consider and think about.
And I think that's a very good point that it's good to look at things in context and to make friends with other local growers too, because yeah, everybody, it's different doing it yourself versus, getting to know people who are also doing the same thing because you can swap plants, you can swap ideas, you can say, wait a minute, I've got this showing up. Are you dealing with this as well? And then, brainstorm and come up with a solution together if there is a solution. Some years it might be we're just not going to have a peach crop this year, but other times it might be, oh man, the cicadas are hatching, make sure you've got ducks or chickens, let them eat 'em or something, or make sure you get a little extra fertilizer on those plants so they're a little bit more chew resistant, something like that. Or so it's all very
One
important.
of the things that one of the things that I realized some time ago was when I was foliar spraying my garden. I recognize, well, why am I only doing this to my garden? Shouldn't I be doing this to my entire property? Because it's an ecosystem, and to try and nurture just this small patch of land within this larger doesn't really make any sense at all. And so I recognized that it was important to feed the entire ecosystem. So when I foliar spray now, I don't just foliar spray these fruit trees or that patch of Brussels sprouts or whatever it might be. I actually wait for a light breeze and I just hold my foliar sprayer up and walk all around my property and make sure the entire ecosystem is becoming nurtured. And so now I have an increase in, I mentioned frogs and snakes. I have hawks that hang around on my property on a regular basis. You could almost name them because there's just so much to eat. Watching the bluebirds and watching the different birds that eat bugs and watching them hunt in my garden at nighttime is lovely. The bears are a little bit tough, but I've got a lot of bears around. In fact, 2 years ago, the biggest pest I had in my garden was a moose that came and was eating my beans. Now, I didn't have much to say to that moose. All I could do was harvest my beans before it ate it all. But the point is that there's an entire ecosystem that's being developed and growing, and the whole landscape is becoming a different landscape.
Yeah, and we're seeing that here too. We've been here about almost 20 years now. And when we came here, the property that we're working on currently was just an abandoned cow pasture. And the neighbor very considerately mowed it every year to keep it, down in grass in case somebody wanted to use it as pasture again. And so those awful autumn olives didn't take over because they want to take over everything and, fix nitrogen and provide habitat and edible berries and all those terrible things that they do. And I am a person who's not overly concerned about some invasive species, I'll admit, because I think everything's native to the planet Earth. And then I also noticed that if you change the environment, then a lot of times the species change too. So, they show up and then they disappear because you've changed things. And so, not so concerned about that. But we are surrounded by monoculture factory farms. And so many things come to shelter here because it's the last diverse habitat in the area. And we've put in a couple of ponds and, like you were saying, the songbirds, I was just listening to the wrens that have come back and the orioles are visiting and the robins and the, just so many different birds. And we've got, of course, the bigger pond birds too. And we just spooked an egret this morning as we were taking our morning walk, and the salamanders. And we've got, I don't know, at least 5 to 7 different types of frogs and toads that all breed in the ponds. And it's just amazing the diversity of life that has returned. Like, we didn't bring any of it. All we did was just create a better spot. We just took care of the soil, and then the rest of it is taking care of itself. So,
Right.
and so if you could wave your magic wand, where would you like to see the regenerative agriculture movement? How would you see that unfolding on a larger scale? I know you've got your YouTube channel, which everybody should check out. You can just search Nigel Palmer on YouTube and you'll find that. And he shares a lot of information there. And, but how would you educate people about this? How would you reach a larger audience? How would you transform the industrial food system? I know that's a big ask, but what the heck, right?
Well, so I recognize that the biggest movers and shakers are the home gardener. In World War II, victory gardens were really popular, and people grew food in their front yards or their backyards in small gardens. I see that movement as really important today. And as more of us grow food in that tiny space in our front yard or backyard, it's going to do a whole bunch of things. The first thing is it's going to make awareness to the whole ideas of the agricultural conversations that we're having. The second thing it's going to do is get people's hands in the soil, which is very important to their own health and well-being. It makes them aware and cognizant of what's really going on around them rather than what's on TV or whatever it might be. And then the third thing is it's going to give them a flavor for real food. And these all will translate into better decisions in the grocery store. And it's our decisions that we make. We vote 3 times a year, 3 times a day when we're trying to eat something as to what it is that we're going to eat. And a higher awareness of what's available and what we really need is going to affect that. So I see that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is to provide people a toolbox of ideas that they could use to learn all of these things and become aware of the importance of real food and the importance of taking care of the earth and the importance of taking care and feeding the soil. And so my hope is that the normal person, you and me, continue to work to bring these awarenesses to people. And as people become aware and become familiar with real food, to not only seek it financially 3 times a day, but also talk about it and recognize how important it is. The misconceived notion that using pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides is required to grow healthy food is just an obvious, blatant, misguided message. But it takes thinking and working with plants to recognize how misguided it is. The idea that healthy plants don't need pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides is fundamental and obvious once you start looking at the situation. And I think that by having the average person grow their own food and start to understand these things is the only way to make change.
You had mentioned being able to remediate glyphosate in the soil to break it down more quickly. Could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, in conversations that I had with Don Huber many years ago, he recognized that the juice that's left over from making sauerkraut in factories was a great remediator of glyphosate. And so these are very simple tools that we have available to us to remediate in our own gardens. Again, fermentation, when you think about it, is a biological process that does all kinds of amazing things. For instance, when I feed my honeybees, I'll put a very small amount of organic apple cider vinegar in the sugar water that I feed, or the honey water that I feed my bees.
Mhm.
And the idea is that this is going to help heal the gut of the honeybee. And a lot of the problems that honeybees have is very similar to the problems that we have, is their guts
Mhm.
are all messed up from ingesting all of these chemicals. And so this is a way to remediate the gut of a honeybee so that they can become more healthy themselves. So there's an example of something that's readily available that could be used in your garden. I mean, spreading pickle juice, if you will. It
Mhm.
sounds like a silly idea, but when you think about it, it's a brine product. And if you use sea salt, it's loaded with minerals. And there's an active bacteria that's living in that brine that has the ability to digest things like glyphosate.
Mhm. And that's a now naturally fermented pickle as opposed to a vinegar pickle heat process. But
Exactly.
um yeah. What have you seen any work done with people using something like kombucha in the soil that's, specifically liquid brewed on a larger basis?
Kombucha is highly acidic, very similar to vinegar, organic apple cider vinegar. And I've
Mhm.
had a lot of people talk about using kombucha to make vinegar extractions, right?
Mhm.
You're still using the low acidity of the kombucha in order to leach out minerals. And so it makes sense idea. When you have things that are low pH, by definition, they have lots of hydrogen atoms available, and that is a good thing for a lot of soils. That moves the voltage towards a more negative, and it moves the acidity towards lower acidity or higher acidity, lower pH.
Mhm.
And so in a lot of soils, those are all good things for balance in the soil.
So, is there anything else that you'd like to get in before we wrap up? And then I would say also things, books, study guides, YouTube channel, something that you would recommend to people too.
There's an amazing amount of information out there right now, and it really depends on what direction you want to take your research. There's a lot of YouTube stuff out there. John Kempf has a site and podcasts that are very influential and interesting. Acres USA has just changed hands and is no longer owned by a board, but owned by an individual who actually is a farmer. There's some good articles and resources in there. There are many, many good books to read, and most of them are old. The bibliography in my book has pages of really interesting things to read. It really depends on where you are in the spectrum of learning. You can read things like my Marshner's Minerals book, or you can read something simple. So the key is to just start looking and start learning and start doing. I think doing is probably as important as reading. And as you start reading, you'll learn more and more about what's going on. So I think that the answer is just get going.
Yeah, and I think once you start doing, then it tends to prod you one way or another, for your additional research, because something will come up and then you'll look for an answer and go from there.
I think making homemade mineral amendments is a really important aspect of starting down the path and becoming not reliant on the stuff that's bought in the store. The stuff that's bought in the store is highly processed. It's not sustainable. And a lot of times it's not regenerative either. But closing waste gaps in order to make homemade mineral amendments is a sustainable idea. And it starts putting you in the mindset of what's available in your backyard. Those cow bones that you made bone broth with, those eggshells that you throw away in the garbage or at best compost, the shells from the ocean. For those people that are in the Midwest and not near an ocean, those oyster shells that you had for dinner, those oysters that you had for dinner, take those oyster shells and take them home with you and make a vinegar extraction or crush them up and use the dust to feed your plants. Those are loaded with minerals. So there's a lot of material that's available to us in our backyard, whether it's the plants, whether it's the feathers, whether it's the bones, whether it's the shells, whatever it all is, the sheep wool. There's all these resources that are available to us that people don't necessarily recognize as being important. And so I think that the awareness of what's in your backyard and how easy it is to process them using fermentation or a vinegar is a really fundamental aspect of agriculture for the home gardener.
Mm-hmm. If
and
you're going to use
pesticides.
Yep. If you were going to use, say, immature apples or something that dropped, and to make a ferment out of that, are those still going to have the same spectrum of nutrients as the adult apples would, or not as much because they just didn't have as much time to fill out?
So this is one of the reasons that I put this database together, is because, first of all, I wanted to convince myself that there was something in these fermentations and vinegar extractions. And then once I started actually putting the data out there, it became totally obvious to me how plants remove minerals from the soil in different proportions that are in the soil. So you go do a soil test, whether it be a Millick 3 or a Morgan, whatever it is, and it's going to tell you the spectrum of minerals that are in the soil, right? And we're led to believe that they have to be in this proportion or that proportion. And those are fun conversations, and they're important conversations. Understanding excesses as well as deficiencies is a very important conversation. But the fact of the matter is that the plants remove minerals from the soil in different proportions that are in the soil. And they do this by having a diverse biological activity in the soil. One of the important things about having diverse biology is this is giving plants a toolbox of living things that they can use to change the voltage and the acidity in the soil in order to mine minerals in proportions that they want. Plants are nature's remineralization system. They bring minerals of different proportions from deep in the soil up to the top of the soil and lay them on the soil for us for the following years. Also, their roots that are in the soil have different mineral proportions than that which is in the soil. And I also have a lot of organic matter in those roots. I never pull roots out of my soil anymore, unless I'm going to grow something there that I want to eliminate competition. But having those roots in the soil is another way of enhancing the soil. And so the point is that plants are an amazing source of minerals. And once we understand that and we start using them, we begin to work with nature. Once we understand that this is nature's mineralization program, by doing these sorts of things, understanding the components that are in those homemade mineral amendments, now we're starting to work with nature rather than against her. So the answer to your question is yes, whether it's a young apple, an old apple, the leaf from the apple tree, those are all going to have broad spectrum mineral compositions that are different from the soil and what apples want. If I wasn't going to pick that tomato from the plant in the fall and that tomato fell on the ground, then those seeds that are in the tomato would be nurtured by that tomato fruit the following year. And of course, germination is the most important aspect of plant development. And so nature is showing us the way in that the seed is being nurtured by the tomato fruit going forward. So why not work with nature and make a fermented plant juice of tomatoes and then have that on a shelf, 1 quart of that on the shelf, we're going to dilute it 500 to 1. So that's 125 gallons of fermented plant juice of tomato, and use that to nurture our tomato plants going forward. That is a fundamental, basic, best you can do fermentation fertilization amendment for a tomato plant. And so it's these ideas that are just total basic and intuitive once you start thinking about them, that are the basis of beginning and then moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, use what you have because it's there, and yeah, it's figured out for us if we can only learn to understand. Yeah. Well, it has been great talking to you and very interesting stuff. And I would definitely be checking out your YouTube channel more. And thank you so much for your time. And yeah, keep fighting the good fight, sharing all the good information.
Thank you, Laurie, and the same to you. Keep up the communication.
All right. Have a good one. All right. Bye.
Thank you, too. Bye, Laurie.